So actually last
Because
night...
you would never wear a shirt for your... Okay. You would just never wear a shirt. Sorry.
Nice, thank you. Great intro.
And we're live. With that, I'm Libby Clark, Editorial Director at the New Stack, and I'm here with the team from Oracle. We're going to talk about the SRE Workbench, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves one by one. We're here at KubeCon and CloudNativeCon in Europe, and I guess we can start there. Do you want to take it away, TJ?
I'm TJ Fontaine. I'm an engineer at Oracle working on our container-related portfolio.
Mickey Boxell. I'm a developer advocate at Oracle on the Cloud Native Labs team.
My name's John Reeve. I run product management for a lot of our container management offerings on Oracle Cloud.
Great. Well, so maybe we could just start with just a basic explainer. What is SRE Workbench and the Cloud Native Labs that are working on it, and then I would really like to get into a discussion about just containers, containers in production, and what that means.
Cool.
John, did you want to go ahead? Or?
Go ahead, Mickey.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. I'll kick it off.
Yeah.
So I guess a lot of what I've personally worked on as far as observability tools are basically just trying to figure out what are some best practices and sort of best of breed open source solutions that we can install on top of OKE, our Kubernetes platform. Mm-hmm. So it's basically just been looking through the CNCF portfolio, seeing which projects are the ones that are most frequently used by people, also getting feedback from our users about which projects they're using, and then just going through the process of implementing them, making sure everything checks out and works properly, and then trying to come up with basically scenarios in which people might actually use them in production.
Mm-hmm. And these are tools that are helpful for an SRE role?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So things that provide insight into logs, into trace data, and into just basic metrics and other sort of telemetry data.
So when you're looking at the cloud native landscape and you have 500 projects that you're trying to choose from,
or 5,000,
or 5,000, or whatever, then so basically you're trying to make the job easier for choosing.
Yeah, I mean, really cutting through that 500 to a set, a manageable set, and a manageable set of best practices that kind of Mickey works on, Mickey and team, for the folks that are trying to absorb these technologies and use them.
So what are the challenges that you are addressing? Maybe you could.
Well, as an engineer, what I'm looking for observability in the system is understanding some kind of balance between how much information I want. Like, I always want as much data as possible whenever something's going wrong, but that's not always feasible from the environment, right? Because there is a cost associated with storing all that information. So finding the right balance for the tools and being able to figure out how much can I store in which area, and then are there other platform services that I can leverage to make it more affordable, but I still have the visibility that I want. So usually when I'm building services for myself or advising other teams on what they're trying to build, I look for solutions that allow you to do like high cardinality and lower retention that you can run in situ on your cluster in your environment, and then leveraging platform services for longer retention. So like maybe I'll roll out my logs or my telemetry into object storage or something along those lines. So that's usually the balance that I try and strike when solving the problems.
Are you? I guess my thinking is when you're I need to take a break for a second. When you're approaching the challenges of running containers, how are you? I guess I just wanted to step back for a second and talk about the SRE role and how you approach those decisions, versus like how a developer would view that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big differences, and you guys pitch in what you're looking for. For me, I look at, these are my SLOs, my service level objectives. This is what I'm trying to achieve, and then I have to figure out how I'm going to monitor and manage those pieces. So for each component that I might have in my system, I need to figure out how I'm expecting it to behave, and then figure out how I can monitor and make sure it's doing that part.
Yeah, I mean, to me, containers are another delivery mechanism, to deliver an application, right? So we had VMs, we've had physical machines, but now we've got containers, there's functions, serverless, there's new technologies, obviously. But at the end of the day, the ability to map it back to your application, your service level objectives, or service level agreements maybe that you have with the business. To me, it's about satisfying that, right? So it's about meeting for the application. So, as we get into this, from a technology perspective, like, okay, what containers are running my application? I potentially have a lot more containers than I did VMs potentially, depending on, how I'm architecting my application. What does that look like, So kind of starting from there, always making sure you think about the application, because again, a container is just a delivery vehicle, really.
Yeah, and to your point, it's also factoring in the business as well. Because when you run into a bug, when you run into downtime, it's not just something that the developers have to address. There's real tangible effects that disseminate throughout your entire business. So you do have to have things like SLAs in place, because there are, of course, customers that are going to have to deal with outages related to those bugs. So I think one thing that's nice about the SRE role is, rather than just sort of reactive or internal monitoring, it's recognizing that there is a wider impact to everything that's happening.
Well, and then there's another aspect to that of being able to test and debug, maybe while you're in production, right? So what does that look like?
I mean, hopefully everybody's trying to drive every problem to a root cause and figure it out. But there's a balance between, depending on the customer impact of what's happening with that issue. Sometimes the right reaction is to immediately restore service as fast as possible, depending on what's happening. So you try and capture as much state, and then hopefully you have tools that help you automate those pieces. But it depends on where you are in your maturity, right? Like if it's a new system or a new application that you're building, you may not have all of that automation in place in the beginning.
So what does the stack look like right now? Like what are some of those tools that you think are kind of indispensable?
I would say probably most fundamentally are Prometheus and Grafana for metrics collection. I think Prometheus was the second graduated project from the CNCF after Kubernetes itself. And it is just a tool that I've seen just about every single person use. One thing I'll say about it is that I am terrible writing PromQL, and writing their query language is really robust, but not the simplest or most straightforward thing. So having a tool like Grafana that allows you to visualize Prometheus data, but also interact with it in an easier way, is so helpful. Like, for instance, configuring an alert in Grafana versus configuring an alert directly in Prometheus, one I've been able to do, one I have not been able to do. So, they really are just the easiest way of visualizing data related to your environment. And also, you were talking about the challenge of how do you know how much data is enough, and how much, I think just trying to avoid creating too much data, more than you actually need. And one thing that's nice about metrics that separates them from things like logs is just that since it's all numerical, you can compress it a lot more easily. You can sample it a different way and get a lot of helpful data over time without overburdening your systems. Aside from those two, do you guys want to chime in?
No, I was going to say, the only thing, you do need to pay attention, because if you Prometheus will just use up as much disk space and as much memory as
Fair
it
enough.
wants. So you should pay attention a little bit to like what your retention window will be, because you'll have some surprises later. But I totally agree with you on everything else. And the other thing that's really nice, as an example from Prometheus, is that its read and write extensions actually allow you to integrate well with other platform parts. So I've been working for an internal project right now, extending Prometheus to be able to reach our internal telemetry system for what we use for building OCI, so that I can have in one Prometheus query, I can query stuff that's been being scraped inside the cluster, as well as stuff that's in the rest of the telemetry, so I can react to other things that are happening. So Prometheus is really compelling from what it can do up front, as well as its ability to be extended for your environment. Logging is another big part. So
yeah, I mean, EFK, Elasticsearch, Fluentd, Kibana seems to be a pretty common, stack on the logging side as well. I mean, I'll throw something out there. This is a little bit old school, but I think we talked about how do you diagnose issues, right, in production, but a big part of it is also trying to prevent things from happening, right? So this is a little bit older, but in the older ITIL kind of framework days, right? You know, and even it's even true today. Like a lot of downtime is caused by changes, right? So being able to kind of get automation around your pipelines and your testing and those kind of things, super important in terms of driving down, you know, or reaching those SLAs or improving your SLAs.
And then related to that also is a canary of some kind that can find out something's wrong before your customer has to tell you, right?
Right.
Like you want to be able to find out customer impact and customer happiness and success before they realize that. So it's really important that you're aware of what's happening.
Are we segueing to release management now, or should we
know.
talk? We might want to touch tracing for a second first.
You do what you need to do.
All right. So I think just the one last piece of the toolkit. So we had Prometheus and Grafana. We talked a little bit about the EFK stack. I think FluentD actually just became another graduated member of the CNCF recently. But also in addition to that is tracing. So making sure you are able to identify where in a distributed system the problem is really occurring. So it's tracking spans. And I think they announced today or recently that Open Census and Open Tracing, which are two of the major frameworks, are actually coming together and forming Open Telemetry. So that's,
is that going to make your life easier?
I just don't use Open Census, so maybe it'll make someone's life easier. But I think that's also it's a really helpful piece of the puzzle. You know, not just identifying that an issue is occurring, but identifying where the issue is occurring. You know, being able to say, this is happening in this particular service, in this particular namespace, and then just being able to jump into the log straight from there.
Yeah, and what gets measured is what gets fixed, right? So if you have something that's taking a long time, distributed tracing allows you to identify, usually, this is the exact component that's taking a long time, so you don't have to go back through the logs and figure out and piece it back together.
So I saw a presentation this morning, actually, of someone who had installed Istio on their laptop and was using that for debugging. Is that something that you're experimenting with?
I swear I've given that presentation before. Yeah, no, it's so helpful for release management and also so helpful for, we were talking about canary deploys, also blue-green deployments as well. You know, I think one thing that was cool, I went to that presentation as well, was the network mirroring, which I hadn't seen before. But yeah, just having those different tools and having them without application rewrites is so nice. You don't have to, like, the app
without going in your code, right? Like
exactly, yeah. It's like the app that I typically demo has a particular type of slow request that just injects a latency into the code itself. But you don't have to do that if you're using something like Istio, and you can just manage the traffic yourself. So you just change the service definition, and it just works for you.
The demos are really compelling. From an operational experience, I still have some skepticism around how big of a hammer service mesh is for a lot of people. There are a lot of really compelling, interesting things: circuit breakers, retries, service discovery, authentication, AAA kinds of pieces, telemetry. I love all of those things individually, and I would certainly, when evaluating things, if you could put it all in one bucket and I could just like check it once, that'd be fantastic. There are some concerns that I would caution people. If it's a net new application, I think it's a lot easier, and when you're building the service or building everything, it's a lot easier to adopt it and learn and grow with it. If you have an existing deployment, I would be judicious with your usage of it, is how I would encourage you to adopt it.
Yeah, I may be the worst Helm user in the whole world, but somehow every single time I try to upgrade one component of my Istio environment, I delete like 8 pods. I've had to reprovision Grafana more times than I can count. And it's funny because I swear I'm following all of their instructions, and somehow just stuff is gone.
It's easy for humans to make mistakes.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
And it's also easy for software to have bugs.
Also true.
Well, and I mean, in the presentation, I was doing everything manually, which also kind of increases the likelihood that something's going to go wrong, right?
Absolutely.
So maybe we could talk about the automation component then, because that's something you brought up earlier. So how are you accomplishing that?
Well, I think in a lot of ways. So we talked about the pipeline and folks automating their pipelines and their testing, right, to try and prevent problems up front. I think it is interesting with things like Istio, service mesh, tracing. I think we have a kind of an interesting source of instrumentation now. So again, it's all about the application, right? And we can understand which components of our application are talking to one another. We understand which containers are actually part of this application. So I think we've got an interesting set of data now and relationships to have another level of abstraction where we can potentially drive more automation. And I think you're going to start seeing that, right, in a lot of the tool sets here to, remediate issues potentially automatically and those kind of things. So
and there's a lot of examples of those parts that exist today in the form of the operator frameworks and all those pieces. So everybody's taking like the WebLogic operator that we did, there's the MySQL operator, there's a Prometheus operator, a whole bunch of operators out there in the operator framework, et cetera. Those are all key components. Right now they're focused on largely making it easier to automate stateful workloads on top of Kubernetes. But the pattern is valid for more than just that. And you can say, you can define these higher level objects in Kubernetes using CRDs. They can be anything. You can then control the logic that it means to automate whatever it is that you need to do, consume the tracing or telemetry from whatever environment you need to, use it as an input to that system, and then react and close the loop so that you have fewer humans involved.
I mean, I think in the keynote, you kind of nailed it, which was, Kubernetes is just a really control system, and we have the opportunity now for a higher level or higher order control systems, right, that can orchestrate these environments beyond Kubernetes, right? So that's exactly what the operators are doing. So, yeah, there's good, I think, good automation potential here.
So when you say beyond Kubernetes, you mean in hybrid environments?
Other than just the orchestration of containers themselves, like the operators which control stateful workloads, but now potentially operators, to TJ's point, that can do other things, right? Like look at the environment, maybe reconcile it to some other kind of desired state, right?
So we have an open source project on GitHub. It's under Oracle OCI-Manager, which allows you to model your cloud resources as Kubernetes objects. So then you can define this, workload, and then it will go out. It'll create your virtual network for you, the subnets and the firewall rules, and then launch instances and then run it for you. So you can actually, in our example, you can actually orchestrate using Kubernetes containers, VMs, bare metals, functions. It doesn't actually matter, but you use all of the tool chain that you're used to and all of that management that you're used to from the Kubernetes ecosystem, and it all just functions exactly the same, but it doesn't have to be just about containers. It could be about anything that you can model from your cloud or on-prem or wherever, however that cloud is provided to you, private or public.
You have to build those operators yourself, though, according to the workloads that you have.
I mean, some of them are generic enough that you can apply them in different ways. The operator framework actually makes it easy to kind of like plug into existing common patterns of like, this is a leader or follower kind of pattern. So you just kind of plug in, this is what I do specific here for the leaders, and this is what I do for the followers. But yes, you do have to, we will have to boil the ocean. But I mean, if you look at it from an SRE perspective, is automation going to obviate the SRE role, right?
That's the next question,
That's
right?
you're going, right?
Well, so we didn't remove all the factory workers when automation came for the factory floor. And that basically what's going to happen is all the people who are doing SRE roles today are more likely to be writing the software that does the automation. That's the most likely transition for their role. They have the domain experience, they codify that domain experience as code, and then it runs in the environment. I think that's the most likely outcome, and I think it's a welcomed outcome because I'm really lazy. I don't like to do any work, and so the less work I have to do, the better off it is for everybody.
So maybe you could talk about the future, the SRE of the future. I think, what do you see that being?
Well, I think one thing we talked about earlier is just that the SRE role itself, someone's going to have to be there up front to basically establish those best practices across an organization, to have both the technical discussions, reminding people to actually implement tracing into their application, but also have those business discussions to define like SLIs, SLOs, and SLAs. And so things like that are still going to have to be done up front. So it doesn't matter how much automation exists. You're not going to be able to automate those business discussions. So someone's going to actually have to think in a very general way about how the business is being impacted by everything.
So I agree. And then I think the other parts are, at the end of the day, automation can only do so much. It's not going to be able to RCA every problem. So the good news is that as you get automation, when there are places the human can now focus solely on not repetitive tasks as much as it is providing, again, business value, instead of just, as well as saying, hey, this is what we're monitoring, this is how we think about the application. But when there is a problem in production, I can provide very specific, targeted diagnostics and forensics for what's actually happening and solve the problems that unblocks business value in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I think an interesting thing as you get into the enterprise world, right, is there's always a set of compliance policies, constraints, these kind of things, right? And so back to the role of the human, if you like, is every business is somewhat unique. So how do I map those constraints? It's really, we have the automation, we're going to have automation, and we're going to have the frameworks, but somebody's going to have to map the constraints of that business onto that framework. So I think, there's a lot of work there. So I think that's probably one way that this could evolve.
So I want to hear war stories. With the people the customers that you're working with, what are some of the things that some of the challenges that they're facing? How are they kind of dealing with some of these customization issues that and are how much are you able to do with through knowing what the stack should be essentially?
Well, I think I'll start. One obvious one is they generally businesses don't want to be locked in, right? So this is what's great about the CNCF, what's great about open source. They want to adopt open standards. So, because obviously that's a huge challenge, right? If I'm a customer and generally I want my workloads or my applications potentially to be portable. I want to make sure, and then how deep do you go, right? How deep do you integrate with that cloud provider? And so there are a fair number of customers that want to run a vanilla Kubernetes, for example, or definitely a managed Kubernetes, but and to have so that they have that peace of mind that they can potentially move things around, or from on-prem to the cloud and so forth. So I think that's definitely something we've heard. Not sure if that's a war story, but it's probably going with your eyes open kind of thing.
One of the recent ones is that from an SRE perspective, you've added telemetry and logging and all the places that you can think of about what you've built of your own things, and then what you forget is that you still have a system that you're running on that you also have to monitor and maintain and understand, right? Like Kubernetes makes it easy to think about to approach infrastructure and deploy your application, but you don't get to forget that infrastructure is still there. So in this particular case, the customer had thousands of Kubernetes services, which with the version of kubeproxy that they were running that was using IP tables as the implementation, those thousands of services resulted in hundreds of thousands of IP tables rules, and that caused network processing per every packet, processing in the IP tables chain. It was a lot of processing, and so they were having performance problems, right? And so everything about your logs and everything about your application that you wrote all looks like it's acting fine, but at the very basic level, the system's ability to communicate via TCP between two components was impacted. And so for an SRE role and for DevOps and everybody out there operating your environments, it's always the things that you take for granted that work are always the things that you forgot to monitor and manage later, and then you have to come back and understand that. So that's an important thing, that just because it's easy to deploy your application on infrastructure and in the cloud with Kubernetes doesn't mean that you get to forget that all of the same constraints existed before Kubernetes still exist, and you're still responsible for them.
And the catch-22 of that too is, right, that you have to have the logging and tracing and everything in advance of that happening.
Yeah. Or you have to be ready and willing, able to dive in pretty deep, pretty fast.
Yeah. I mean, are you finding that your customers are able to do that?
Everybody has a different set of skills.
Yeah.
So some customers are able to do it. Sometimes it's all brand new to them, but they're excited to learn. I think that's the one thing that I like about the Kubernetes ecosystem is every time someone's using it, they're really excited to learn all of the different components. They're not terrified of it. At least from whom I've interacted with. Yeah,
but it's on the flip side, and we talked about it up front, like there's 500 projects.
Yeah.
So I don't have time to look through 500. So I think there's a definite need that we're seeing and we're still pretty early, right, in the big scheme of things in terms of enterprises moving on to these technologies. So having a guidance, having best practices, having a set of things that are recommended or a platform that you can move to, I think it for the majority is going to be really important. We've moved beyond the hobbyist, right, and we're moving into kind of the more of the mainstream. So that's I think a coming wave here theme.
Yeah, and I think people are also very happy to accept help. Not just hearing what the best practices are, but also just hearing implementation details from other customer experiences. And I think it helps us when customers take that approach, because they do get everything set up front in the proper way, and they can triage their own issues. And it's not just, let's file a support ticket that's going to go into a black hole somewhere because no one else has the data they actually need to solve the issue. So, one thing that we worked on was exposing our public telemetry data as a data source for Grafana. And what's nice about that is, like TJ was saying, now you have insight into your telemetry information from all of the resources running on your cloud provider, and it's in the same dashboard that you have all of your service information on Grafana. So you're not just getting a part of the picture, you're getting the whole picture all in one place. So I think when we're able to be proactive, when people really implement this stuff early and think about the best practices and really have a good system design plan, you're able to work out a lot of this stuff before it becomes a big issue.
Yeah, that's the thing that I've always heard about running microservices, is that it's like finding a needle in a haystack when you're trying to debug. So
when the haystack's on fire.
When the haystack is on fire, yes. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to have you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.